to summarize from last week, we saw that God is the source of scientific knowledge. So we have to understand that in a way that God is the source of all things. God is the creator of the universe. God set into motion the laws of the universe, the way in which the universe operates. He also gave us the knowledge to understand the way in which the universe operates as a progressive revelation. So we have to understand, though, that God is the creator in a very um, theological and not literalistic sense. So, for example, if we believe that God created the world in 6 days, that the earth is 6,000 years old, that's the basis of creation, then we are missing the point and committing the same error as our anthropocentric opponents. And in fact, that is a form of anthropocentrism. That in fact, the anthropocentric version of creation is that God created the heavens and the earth in 6 days. He put us in the earth as the summit, the acme of his creation, gave us dominion over it. We live, we die, we go to heaven. And isn't that wonderful? Yeah. But that's a distorted view, as we saw a couple of weeks ago when we were discussing the theology of creation from Pope Benedict, that in fact God created the heavens and the earth. He created his entire creation. He placed us in it as stewards and custodians, as tillers and caretakers. So we live, we die, but at some point there will be a new heaven and a new earth. All of God's creation will be reconstituted. We'll be given resurrected bodies, but all of God's creation will be restored. So that's a very different narrative, and one that is not anthropocentric, because we see ourselves simply as a part of God's creation, as we see ourselves as one very small part of the enormity and the magnitude of what God has created. So the basic problem is that whenever we forget that God is the creator, and whenever we have an incorrect theological understanding of what that means, we displace God. And whenever we displace, so God is the source of all things. It's all about God. God, for us as Christians, should be the center of our focus. It should not be about what God does for us, what God gives us, although God does, and that's wonderful, but that's not what it's about. It's about God. We're called to be servants of God. We're called to be a people of sacrifice, to sacrifice ourselves for God. So when we forget about all of that and substitute some other theology or some secular understanding, everything becomes unmoored from its origins, which is God. And we end up with, in some form, a culture of relativism. So a culture of relativism is rooted in, any of a number of things. So we talked last week about Descartes, I think, therefore I am, so that my ideas define the world around me. So if a tree falls in the forest and I'm not there, the tree hasn't fallen because I haven't heard it and I haven't perceived it, and therefore it doesn't exist. So basic idealism is that my thinking shapes and makes the world around me, but my thinking doesn't shape and make the world around me. God has made the world around me, and He's made me, and He's allowed me to think about the world in some way. So there's egotism. Practical relativism also takes any number of other forms. There's cultural bias, there's xenophobic and nationalistic bias, there's racial bias, there's class bias, there's economic bias, there are all sorts of social inequalities and forms of exploitation that have their origin in a culture of relativism, so that I become better than you. My nation is better than your nation. My social group is better than your social group. My race is better than your race. My economic status is better than your economic status, and you're not worthy of the same dignity and don't have the same attributes as people like me. So that basic culture of relativism becomes basically unavoidable if we forget about God. God and the fact that God created the world around us, that God imparted some part of His divine image throughout in every part of His creation, that none of God's creation was junk, that we all are, as human beings, are intimately tied to God's creation. We weren't placed here to own it or to dominate it or to destroy it, but rather to be a part of it, to care for it. We were placed here in relationship to one another to see in one another the divine image. Human beings, far more than any other object or species or form of life, bear the divine image. And so we should have to see the divine image in each other rather than work to destroy one another or dominate one another or take advantage of one another.
Well, I think it misconstrued when God said, "Your dominion of all these creatures." I think that they misunderstood that. They think, "Oh yeah, God, give me the power. I'm in charge, right?"
Right, right. The yeah, there's an interplay, kind of between understanding and uh, well, what you understand. I mean, so the goal. I mean, how should how should I put this without being unduly nasty?
That's okay.
Want me to cover my ears? No.
There's the starting point in many ways of the anthropocentric Christianity is a real often a real selfishness and a real sense of self-righteousness that
Oh
God
yes.
has saved me or He saved us, some
Yep.
narrow group. I mean, we see it, with the kind of nastiness of the Pilgrims, at the very foundation of American Christianity. I mean, that they were intolerant, bigoted, narrow-minded, nasty people.
And these were Christians?
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. These are the
They were?
pilgrims, you
Oh,
know. these are the people who, you know, regardless of economic status, launched lawsuits against one another. You know, and you know, they burned one another at the stake, and you know, they had a particularly you know, murderous relationship with Native Americans. So and you know, I mean, they left Europe largely because they weren't wanted, because you know, I mean, admittedly, you can argue that you know, much of Europe was, by the standards of Christianity, had backslidden, but nevertheless, they were worse.
Mm.
They were at the
So
bottom of the barrel, huh?
they were at
Yeah.
the bottom of the barrel, right?
That's still
So
happening. Yeah, that's still happening now, you know?
yeah,
Yeah. See that around you. Yeah.
yeah. So you have this self-righteousness, and so it's about us, but
Yeah.
it's not about us at all. It's about God. So whenever we forget that, we completely lose sight of everything. And so, you know, yeah, so we see that it's about God, it's about my salvation, it's about God blessing me. And so, I mean, that's precisely, you know, prosperity theory, and you know, God wants us to feel good about ourselves. Maybe, but that's not, you know, that's not, I mean, he wants us to feel good about ourselves in the midst of tribulation, and in the midst of prosperity, and in the midst of in between, because we look to him and recognize both that he's the source and he's our shield and our protection, not because he's pouring out this good stuff on us. So, um, so yeah, yeah. I mean, there's a real, in Christianity, there often is a real problem with this displacement, that God gets displaced by the things God gives us and by ourselves. So I think that's about as far as we got
Yeah.
last week.
We didn't have time. We were heavy discussion.
So
Mhm.
what paragraph are we on now?
Oh, we're not. We're kind of going. I mean, I've kind of tried to pull together
Yeah.
his
Okay.
argument,
Yeah.
regardless of paragraphs, since the book
Yeah.
is kind of, or is, the chapter is kind of diffuse, and so
I think the last paragraph we went to is 122.
That's what I have open. Yeah.
Yeah. 122. That's where my bookmark is. But
uh-huh.
yeah, I think we covered that. Relevant. Yeah. Anthropocentric.
We were on practical
We
relativism.
covered that. Yeah, that's the last time with our discussion.
Okay, so we have practical relativism, and we have the notion that knowledge comes from us and from our own brilliance and from our creativity and from our profound insight.
Without
So
God help, right?
we're without God's help. So we're
Yeah.
seeing the way in which, you know, we're coming to a deeper understanding of the way in which things work.
Yeah.
So regardless of our brilliance and creativity and whatever else, as you know, social people, we almost always see ourselves as a part of something else. And so so then this leads to the problem of the uh, of epistemology, of technological epistemology. So scientists or technologists, and it's true, you know, also of social scientists and philosophers as well. The process of you acquire knowledge. So the goal of acquiring knowledge is to understand how the world works or how some aspect of the world works. So the goal of acquiring knowledge, of the goal of science, is to find out how the world works. And that provides us with more knowledge about how the world works, which in turn, so the more we know about how the world works, which fuels the pursuit of knowledge.
Mhm.
So there comes to be a vicious cycle in which science and technology, or knowledge of science or knowledge of technology, is both the means and the end. The end is the pursuit of knowledge. The means is the knowledge used to pursue the knowledge, right? And so it's a
cycle.
vicious cycle.
Yeah.
And so out of that vicious cycle, it's easy to forget two things. The first is to forget that life is involved. Human life is involved. Um, Animal life is involved. Plant life is involved. Even inanimate things that shape the life of plants, animals, and ourselves are involved. We can poison the soil so nothing can grow there, in which case we starve, right? Or we can drop nuclear weapons, which besides killing everybody, contaminates everything for
Nothing grow for years.
nothing can grow for years. Exactly. Yeah. So instead of that, so life and the things that sustain life get displaced and forgotten about and left behind, and they become objects to be acted upon. And second, there's this notion that knowledge is inherently good. So the more we know, the better. The more we can control, the better. And at one level, knowledge is inherently good, but on another level, it isn't good. And so just because the knowledge of a good example is the Nazi eugenics movement.
Mhm.
The ability to breed a superior race, does not mean that it should be bred.
Yeah.
The ability to develop nuclear weapons, does not mean they should be used. And so there's a basic problem in this self-perpetuating dynamic, this closed system, that morals and ethics are not applied. Morality and ethics can come from multiple sources, but for Christians whose morality and ethics should be based on the fact that they, one, love their Lord, their God with all their heart, their soul, and their mind, and two, love their neighbors as themselves, should clearly define morality and ethics. And it's unfortunately also here again the case that that doesn't define Christian morality and ethics very often. That's an area in which, unfortunately, as Christians, we're woefully inadequate. So the net result of that is that the our world, life in general, human beings become objects to be acted on and studied rather than to be things that are seen as possessing their own inherent dignity, and therefore that in some form, ethically will limit the damage that can be done. There's also a problem with this, sort of epistemological paradigm, especially when you abstract it and you make it about ourselves. That fundamentally, in Marxist philosophy, this is called the problem of false consciousness. So the problem is that we think we know, right? But our knowledge is always imperfect. We, in fact, don't know. We know reality in the way our culture and the world in which we live has conditioned us to know reality, and that's very partial. So we think we know reality. We act as if we know reality. We act upon a reality under the assumption that we know the principles on which it is based and it acts. And in fact, we don't. Our knowledge is incomplete, imperfect, and partial. This applies as well to Christian theology, not only Marxist philosophy. God knows all things. God is omnipotent. God is the creator of all. God set into motion the world. God allows us partial knowledge, partial insight into the world that God created, but we can never, ever know that, have all knowledge about the totality of God's creation, because God's creation reflects God's omnipotence. It reflects the fact that God is infinite, and our knowledge can never be infinite, and we can never comprehend the infinite other than partially. So St. Paul talks about seeing through the glass partially. That's exactly a depiction, expression of the problem. God is infinite. Even the brightest and most brilliant of us is very limited in comparison to the omnipotence and the infiniteness of God. So that suggests immediately, that there's going to be a huge problem, that we think we know things that we don't know, that we think we know how things will interact when we don't have a clue, that we think through our experimentation, which is the method that particularly science proceeds, and that is very, very valuable. But we think that we can scientifically establish things that we can't possibly scientifically establish. We think that we can deal with all contingencies when we can't even begin to imagine anything other than a very, very, very small, insignificant subset of the contingencies. So a good example was, the salmon being killed by that chemical used to preserve tires.
Yeah.
That's a really horrible thing, that just catastrophic impact.
There's so much stars. Yeah.
But it took 20 years for anyone to figure it out.
Yeah.
You can't who would you can't do scientific tests of something on every living species to see how it's impacted. So you don't know. But the problem is you proceed under the assumption that it's all good and you think you know.
And it seems so clear too that, I mean, why didn't we check this out earlier? Because there's a lot of rain in this area. The water goes right into the rivers.
That's true. That's true.
I mean, there's signs on every drain that says this water goes directly to the bay.
Right, right.
So they know. So how come it took them so long to figure out maybe there was a problem?
Yeah, when they found
Yeah.
out that salmon is dying, that instant they should have, figured out. Hey, let's figure this out. How come the salmon? Where's the cause of it?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Evidently the basic source of so I forget what the chemical is that they put on the tires as a preservative, but although I think that the so when when tires decompose and that substance is mixed with rain and
Yeah.
slight pressure from the tires,
Right. It's heated up. Yeah.
it
Driving. Yeah.
that creates a chemical reaction and creates a new substance. So that substance was found in the salmon, but not known how it got there, and the precise chemical reaction hadn't been documented, I think. So it's a so it's a problem of partial knowledge. It's a problem of not anticipating the problem in advance, and then it becomes a problem of funding. And then that's a point at which we begin to, we sort of begin to move from problems of knowledge and problems of, well, to put it another way, we begin to move to a completely new set of problems that compound the original problem. So here a problem is the funding of research, right? So there's the problem of who pays for research, what are they paying for, are they willing to pay for, and what is the goal? And so most basic research occurs within the context of a capitalist economy. And
I think they think it's not important, not like this vaccine. A lot of rich people giving money, like Bill Gates did, give billions and millions of dollars.
Right.
So with Google and all of those big companies, because they know it's very important. So people is dying, right? And but tires, they don't see. I mean, they don't see the end result of it. Oh, salmon is dying. Well, we can make salmon grow, like the shrimp, like so
right.
they don't. Yeah.
Salmon farms, yeah.
Yeah. Artificial salmon, whatever. They have that now.
Yeah. Yeah.
They're talking about nuclear plants now too in southern Louisiana, in Louisiana area, that are nuclear plants that are emitting these carcinogens into the air. And this is where all the poor people live.
Right.
And they can't afford to uproot and move somewhere else.
Right.
So now they're, and EPA is,
they're having problems with health.
They said it's carcinogens that are going into the air, but they're not doing anything about it.
Yeah.
They just want to put up new plants.
Right. Yeah. The
It's really sad.
EPA has become a uh, agency for environmental destruction rather than protection, unfortunately.
Mm.
Um, so then we begin to have, the economic and political system um, involved in the crisis. So um, the most notable contribution, and this isn't really to exempt socialism or other economic forms, but at least at an economic level, a major contribution to environmental degradation is made by capitalism. Right? So obviously, what is capitalism? Capitalism is an economic system that aims at making a profit. But capitalism does more than aim at making a profit. It aims at making greater profit, or it may aims by making expanding profit by increasing the amount of goods it sells. So to do that, it needs to make more goods.
Yeah.
It needs to create new demand, and it
Yeah.
needs to find new markets.
Yeah.
So
Supply
it
and demand.
what
Supply,
kind?
supply and demand.
Yeah.
More people
Well,
demand. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah. The big thing. Remember last week we talked about Jacques Ellul's propaganda.
Right. Yeah.
A big thing about the demand is that the marketing machine is responsible for creating the demand,
Yeah.
right? So it's not like demand is a separate, sort of independent group.
Right. Yeah.
Problem is, so if we look at the writings of the classic political economists before Malthus, so particularly Adam Smith, there's an infinite supply of small producers who bring goods to market for an infinite number of consumers, right? And
Yeah.
so that adjusts, so the price is adjusted based on supply of demand, and it all works well. But the problem is that even when he was, writing the description of capitalist economy, that was an ideal. And in fact, there are large producers who edge out the small producers. And so they have much greater control over the market because they can withhold their goods, causing a great deal of pain. And so in the modern world, there is not an economy of an infinite number of small producers. There often, in many markets, are only one or two or three producers, right? So, until the Japanese invasion, automobile invasion, right? There was GM, there was Ford, and there was Chrysler. And so there were three automobile manufacturers, and you could buy from one of the three, right? So the problem is that, three companies and the heads of three companies can easily talk to one another. And indeed they did. So, and they shared technology very willingly. So what did they share? Planned obsolescence, right? So your car would last 3 years and then break down, and you'd have to get a new car,
Right. Yeah.
right? And then particularly the Japanese automakers began to spoil their fun by importing cars and then building cars here that can last for, like
For a long time.
Lexus,
Yeah.
possibly 500,000 miles, or uh,
Yeah.
100 or 250,000 miles for a
Right.
fairly low end car, as opposed to something that falls apart after about 36 to 50,
And maintenance free too.
and maintenance free too. Right, right. So, 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 so that vision of the, you know, perfect self-regulating economy of small producers and consumers gets crowded out by large producers who then have control over the market, and then also with their marketing machines have control over consumers. They create the demand that they produce goods to satisfy. So everybody has to have the latest iPhone. Even the poor need to have the latest iPhone. Everybody has to have Nikes or whatever,
Even
because
even the people that even the people that beg on the street, they got iPhone.
yeah, 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 yeah. I mean, there's the sad thing is that there's a basic way in which, and I think we sort of pick it up when we're kids growing up, that if you don't have X, people look down to you and you're down at you, and you're not really as whatever, not
Yeah.
really as alive as they are, not really as human. You're just not as good as they are because they have whatever. And I think we carry that into
Mentality. Yeah. Well,
uh,
I remember when I adopted my two nephew, and I have my two kids, right? And Cody, in the 70s, they only make like $100 a week, you
yeah,
know, 4 children. Okay. So we talked to this, you're not gonna get two toys or three clothes or whatever. I said we're gonna share, like you're gonna have one toy each, and they agree with that. Just talk to them before we go shopping, and you're gonna have two clothes each of you, but not the shoes that you wanted. It has to be the the ordinary
well
one.
made,
Yeah.
not expensive. Yeah.
yeah,
But we can afford it,
Yeah.
Yeah. And
yeah,
and they're okay with that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
yeah. That attitude is,
They're the happy ones. The ones that aren't getting the latest are the unhappy kids
Right. Yeah.
because they're looking for more.
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. It becomes an insatiable machine. I
Yeah.
mean, um, so there's a basic problem there, that the production of this stuff is concentrated in very few hands, that they, with their marketing machines, create the demand for the stuff, that it doesn't kind of happen spontaneously, that their model is to produce an ever increasing number and amount of stuff, so that they have
Yeah.
growing profit and growing revenue and growing profit.
Yeah. You remember
Eh,
before COVID, every year there is a toy that's very in demand, and people line up in the
Yeah,
mall like 3 o'clock in the morning or 4 o'clock to buy this thing for their children.
right,
Every year you have to go through this cycle. Every year they have a new toy, whatever, or game, you know, and then they have to line up, or scooter, the electric scooter. Oh my gosh, you gotta see the line. I go, what are you guys waiting for? Oh, I gotta get this for my children, this electric scooter. This is right now, very popular.
Tickle
right,
me Elmo. Elmo. People were paying ridiculous prices.
I know.
They couldn't
right.
get it.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Do you remember a couple of years ago. It may even have been more than a couple of years ago at some, there was one year at the Black Friday day after Thanksgiving sales when some people were trampled at multiple Walmarts.
Yes,
Mhm.
yes. I
Just a
remember
couple of years ago, yeah, 2 or 3
Yeah,
years ago.
yeah,
Wasn't long.
yeah. So,
Yeah,
I mean, getting your whatever it was, getting a good deal on whatever it was is far more important than human life.
yeah. Yeah, I remember my last Black Friday in Walmart. I worked at the accounting office, and they said, "Well, you're gonna have to go on the floor. I want you to watch this merchandise. This is for Black Friday. They cannot get this merchandise, but people doesn't listen to you. They grab it. Oh, I want this. I want this. Pretty soon you're not gonna have it anymore." So I said, "You can't get it," but they do. They get them. Oh
Yeah,
no, no, I don't want
yeah,
to be. Out. You gotta be out of this. So yeah, I said, "Oh my gosh, terrible." Ah,
So
uh,
now it's not just one Black Friday, it's like a whole month of Black Fridays.
right. Yeah.
Yeah, or
yeah,
starting
yeah.
at the beginning of the month. That's ridiculous.
I think
At
I remember.
least a lot of activity has gone online, so
Yeah.
people get trampled less.
Yeah. Yeah.
But still,
Ron, I remember you saying that everything that's happening um, has something to do. God, it's not punishment. I remember. I don't remember exactly what you said.
Yeah, down
Yeah.
way back at the beginning of our
Yeah.
class
Yeah.
on, I think it was in Matthew, and we were
Yeah.
talking about, um, I think this is what you're talking about. We were talking about that one verse in the Bible,
Yeah.
wasn't it,
Yeah.
Connie?
Yeah. I think so. I don't remember where it is though.
Um,
Is it in Matthew?
no, it's in Second Corinthians. Was it First Corinthians or Second Corinthians 7? Um,
Yeah.
oh, I can find it. Keep talking.
I know.
um, so the basic dynamics of production and the fact that in capitalism, particularly, both capitalism manipulates the demand for which it provides the supply,
Right.
and its model is one of growing production, is very problematic. Also, there's this kind of combined, there's a myth that the resources of the earth are infinite. At the
Mm.
same time, there's a recognition that the resources of the earth are scarce. Right? So, on the one hand, you produce as if the resources are infinite, right?
Right.
So, the automobile industry is intent on producing gasoline and producing cars that will run on gasoline, as if oil is never going to run out. But in fact, oil is a scarce resource. And especially the energy industry has, you know, in some sectors, been very aggressive in trying to suppress alternative energy sources like solar energy. So there's this belief that on the one that everything is infinite and you can just keep drawing on these resources, but at the same time, if that were true, and if they acted as if that were true, that that would make these resources of very little value, right? So if in fact oil were unlimited, then it should be really cheap,
Right.
like, I don't
It
know,
goes.
3 4
Yeah.
cents a gallon.
Mm. It goes
But
up in
in
the summertime.
but in fact, we know it's not cheap. resources aren't cheap, resources aren't finite. And so who owns resources and who can buy resources is really a major point of contention. So we have this myth that everything is unlimited, which encourages production and consumption. And we have, and in fact, a reality that these resources are not unlimited, which ends up placing resources in very selective hands. So particularly the wealthy have the best access to resources. And as people become poorer, access begins to diminish.
Mm.
And
I found that reading. It was in Second Chronicles
Mm.
7:11. No, sorry, 14.
Okay.
And it's
Read it.
if my people who are called by my name humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then I will hear from heaven and will forgive their sin and heal their land. Is that the one, Connie? Is that the one you're talking about?
I don't think so.
There was that was during our Bible study, I think.
yeah, that was the verse that I criticized and drew on Saint Cyprian and his interpretation of the plague in Carthage. So yeah, I mean the using Saint Cyprian's argument about judgment, as well as I think the Gospels and especially John's, there's a way in which ultimately we judge ourselves. So we're confronted with a test, right? So for example, and tests are an ordinary part of human life. It's not, like God sends a test upon you, strickens you with a test. So, taking the coronavirus pandemic as an example,
Yeah.
the
That's when-
pandemic happens, pandemics happen, disease happens, mutations happen. Those are, normal parts of science and epidemiology. So the question then becomes, given the pandemic, how do you respond to it? And, for Saint Cyprian, you can respond in an ungodly way. You can look out for number one. You can care about yourself. And if you do that, then all hell breaks loose, right? Bad things happen. And we see it in our own society. That's really what's gone wrong here. I mean, we have a grotesquely disproportionate share of cases, a disproportionate share of deaths, a ratio of deaths to cases that very similar to the third world, where there is, poor health care, poor access to health care. And in effect, we brought judgment upon ourselves. And the problem when judgment comes, that it affects everybody. It's not merely the guilty. So we've chosen to not care about our neighbor. And unfortunately, particularly as Christians, and there are many Christians who have cared about their neighbor. I mean, among at least certainly the Catholics that we know, everybody is enforcing social distancing and mask wearing. But we've seen, the numerous examples of people who don't wear masks, who think this is a hoax, who believe their rights are being trampled upon, that they're whatever. And So as Christians, they believe that something is about them, and they are clueless about the fact that nothing is about them. And when that happens, judgment happens. And I think Saint Cyprian really makes that point clear. And it's clear in John's gospel. The question isn't, so Jesus proclaims, and the question is, how do you respond? You can respond favorably and accept God and accept Jesus' teaching, or you can respond negatively. You can reject it, and there are consequences for rejecting it.
So what about these people? They have a notion that this is the sign of the end times. All of this happening, is a sign of the end times, and they really believe this, and they're stocking food and canned goods and buying guns and stuff like that. Is it there's gonna be like a people that's gonna try to rob your food, and so
There's
you need to
people that have homes that are underground.
Yeah. Well, the 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 we're studying beginning to study all of that discourse in the end times and in Matthew's gospel, but sort of a quick summary. So there's this belief there are all of the signs of the end, right? There are
right.
wars and rumors of war and earthquakes and whatever and all this other stuff, and so all of that stuff, all of those signs apply to the destruction of the temple. Jesus was, some of them are in fact not so much real signs as symbols that used to indicate that a dramatic change is coming. And so Jesus, at the very early mention of his sign, says that this is but the beginning of the birth pangs. And so that notion of birth is a really important one, that somehow out of all of this disaster, something is being born, suggests a fundamental discontinuity in human history, but not the end of human history. I don't think that would be a birth pang. That's the advent of God. It's the second coming of Christ. So what he's talking about here is the destruction of the temple, that the destruction of the temple marks the end of an age. It marks really the end of temple Judaism, which for religious Jews is the world. Worship of Yahweh is existence is inconceivable without the worship of the one true God. And that's done at the temple and through the temple. So with the temple gone, there's the beginning of the new world, a new world. That new world is the Christian church. So Jesus, and so that's one thing Jesus is saying. And he's also trying to concretely warn those who are and will be his disciples when they should flee from Jerusalem. Because remember, Jerusalem is the early center of Christianity. All of the leaders of Christianity, as it's still a sect within Judaism, are there. And the temple is going to be destroyed by the Romans. The Jerusalem is going to be overrun by the Romans. There's going to be terrible barbarism and among sects, factions within the Israelites in Judaism, including destroying one another's food and water supply, including cannibalism, including just enormous human degradation, even without the Romans. And then the Romans come and level the temple and create all kinds of additional carnage. So Jesus is warning everyone, warning present and future disciples. And so at the time that the Romans laid siege to Jerusalem for the final conquest before General Titus entered the city and destroyed the temple, according to Christian tradition, there were no Christians in Jerusalem for the siege. They had all fled to a nearby city named Pella. So that's what that's about. So when we look for these signs and whatever the signs of the end, what Jesus says about the end very clearly is that, but of that day and hour no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, nor the Son, but the Father only.
Yeah.
There are no signs.
Yeah.
It will come. So that's, this whole end times thing is ridiculous. The
But
notion that we're,
they were reading books that are written by people. Yeah,
yeah,
they
um,
believe it.
the the uh, the notion that even the notion that the end time is near is absurd. We don't know. It may be later this evening. It may
Yeah,
be tomorrow. It may be
right.
next year. It may be in 2,000 years if our planet can live that long. It may
Yeah,
be in 10,000 years.
yeah,
Jesus cautions us, teaches us to be ready. If he's
ready. Yeah,
teaching us to be ready because you don't know the hour, then
yeah.
there are no
Okay.
signs. Why would you need to always be ready if you know the hour and you know the signs that point to the hour? That makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. It's totally absurd. But that hoarding thing is exactly the
Yeah.
the source of the problem, that people are hoarding. I mean, there are,
Oh, they got barrels and barrels of stuff.
in the last few weeks, there have been the most bizarre shortages in the supermarkets.
Yeah.
Shortages of dish detergent, shortages of salad dressing. I mean, there have been enormous, numbers of shortages of, the kind of regular staples I keep
Right.
here, and so
Yeah.
I
The
run
the one
out and go and gone.
the one that we use every day.
Yeah. Um, yeah. So, which is just more of the same. It's particularly this kind of consumer mentality and me first, and I'm more important than everybody else. Um, yeah, and then the whole thing with, well,
Got out of
I'll,
proportion.
I'll stop there.
Yeah.
We won't get into people stocking their firearms.
I know. I just tagged my shoulder when they said, "Oh, are you preparing for what?" I said, "For what?" Well, there's all the sign. Yeah. I said, "Okay, well, no, I don't believe in that." You know.
An even better question is uh, if they think that the signs point to the end,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Then why are they stockpiling stuff?
Yeah.
It's like
That's very ironic, isn't
that,
it?
that presumably means
Right now.
the end of time,
I
or
never thought of that.
so well, when Jesus says be prepared,
Yeah.
he doesn't mean make sure you have enough cans of tuna to last.
Or
Yeah.
rolls of toilet paper.
Yeah, or enough rolls of toilet paper.
Makes sense. Yeah. Oh my goodness. But
Oh, anyway.
people are people are sometimes I don't know, absent-minded. What is the wording for that? Doesn't think or
Yeah, very perverse in their thinking,
yeah, yeah,
just very perverse. I think we've kind of come to sort of a stopping point.
yeah.
I mean, we can,
Are we gonna start with chapter 4 next time?
no, we still have more to discuss with chapter 3.
Oh,
So,
good.
I mean, we sort of just, we sort of got to um, the problem of um, who owns technology. So
Oh, yeah,
one of the issues is that most technological innovation occurs within the context of a capitalist economy. So we've discussed that, but there's also, the problem of political power and political power in its relationship to technology, and that's in many ways that's related, but also very independent. So for example, the
what
Chernobyl.
about what about the about employment? I don't we discuss anything about employment.
That's also related too. Yeah,
Yeah.
uh,
Okay.
that's
Yeah.
that's particularly an issue of the capitalist economy, and
Yeah.
the fact that capitalism suffers from periodic boom and bust cycles. So
Yeah.
during bust cycles, human life is expendable and one's labor force is expendable. Um, but that's yeah, but that so we should talk about that next week, and then
Okay.
talk about political power, and then sort of return to the technological imperative that technology um, becomes a god. So there's this paradox of we think that we elevate technology to uh, a place of ascendancy because we think that technology makes life convenient for us. But technology becomes independent of us and begins to dominate and lord over us. So we become, instead of the masters of technology, or instead of the beneficiaries of technology, we become the victims of technology. That technology, in many ways, it really is technology as a god, because it's a form of idolatry. And the thing about idolatry, on the one hand, the idols are lifeless. They're created by human hands. They're dead. And yet human beings give those idols the power of life and death over them. So this lifeless thing controls human beings.
Especially
That's
Alexa.
Alexa. So that's, yeah, so that's the
She's in so many homes. Everybody keeps talking to Alexa.
yeah, I don't talk to Alexa. I,
I
Alexa
only
will.
yeah, I only talk to
I,
him when I want.
I
When I
can't
pay.
imagine why I would want to tell some device to turn my lights off when,
So,
as long as
eh,
I can walk, I can do it myself.
right,
Uh,
exactly.
I could
I don't want
understand if I couldn't, but
I don't like automated house either. I don't
no,
like that.
no,
Well, and their privacy is invaded because
I mean, you can
everybody knows what's
right.
going on there.
yeah,
Oh my goodness.
Yeah. I mean, weren't they getting all kinds of information from that house? I mean,
Oh yeah, yeah. They're connected.
yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, there are huge. Well, In a lot of ways, privacy has become kind of a thing of the past. Sort
Exactly.
of,
Yeah.
especially in urban areas where, um, yeah, um,
Yeah. No more privacy.
surveillance almost all the time.
Yeah.
Through the TVs and whatever. I mean,
Right,
Yeah.
they can see all your
right. Smart TVs,
yeah.
yeah, which
Yeah.
everyone
All
has
the
to
guys.
have. I'll turn off the recording.